So without further ado, I would like to introduce Charles Bruder. I'm sorry. See, I asked him how to say it, and then I said it wrong. Bruder. He is a student at OSU. He's studying mycology. He's only recently moved out here from New York, where he was a mushroom aficionado out there. And now he's out here. He's studying. He's going to talk about cultivation and sort of how that all relates to agriculture and some other stuff like that. Anyway, he's working on a project. He's at OSU. He's going to school. He's working on some projects there. He might want to talk about those. And here you go.
Thank you so much for coming, everybody, and thanks to the Cascade Mycological Society for having me. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm new to Oregon, so this will be my first mushroom season here. I actually showed up in Oregon last October, and the first day I was here, I went to the mushroom festival at Mount Pigsaw, so that was a good welcoming to Oregon. I grew up in Indiana, and it's a little sad being somewhere where people like mushrooms, because in the Midwest, no one eats mushrooms, and people give you chicken of the woods when they find it because they don't know what it is and they're scared of it. But today we're going to be talking about incorporating fungi into agriculture and kind of the state of mushroom cultivation today as I see it. And we're going to move pretty fast. I want this presentation to have a lot of bouncing off points for people. So we'll cover a lot of ground. And if anybody has questions about things, feel free to bring them up at the end. We have a lot to cover, so if you have a clarifying question, feel free to ask it, but otherwise just save it till the end. So I want to start off today by just having everybody think about how amazing fungi are. You know, we all have our favorite finds. That's one of the things that I really love about mushrooms. We find mushrooms, and there are some that we really don't forget. In the corner here, this is Laetoporus cincinnatus. This is the Midwest and Eastern United States secret. That's the best chicken of the woods species by far, and it tastes way better than the chicken of the woods here. Some reishi species I really like. That's Ganoderma tsugae. The sister species in the West would be Ganoderma oregonense, and then this is Ganoderma sessile, which the sister species is Ganoderma polychromum. But I really love these fungi. And just like all of you, there's a lot of amazing diversity that we've all witnessed in the woods when we find them. So how amazing are fungi? Let's just talk about some of the amazing feats that they can pull off. This is one that many of you have probably heard of, but this is the case of the humongous fungus. So in Eastern Oregon in the Malheur National Forest, there is a giant colony of armillaria that scientists estimate could be potentially as large as almost 2,400 acres in size. And it might be up to 8,000 years old. We don't know exactly. And contrary to what social media might portray, it does not produce giant mushrooms that look like this, though we all wish it did. Those would be some honey mushroom potlucks. In reality, the armillaria, although it's so giant, it still lives underground in the soil, and it lives in trees. It causes a really aggressive rot. And it's really amazing that even for such an ancient giant colony, it can remain unseen. So giant mushrooms, but still very mysterious. Mushrooms are very diverse in their taxonomy. It's really interesting how we love fungi, and yet we're only able to observe a very few number of them. You know, on the lower range of our estimates of how many species of fungi there are, we say the lowest estimate we have is 2.2 million species. So there might even be as many as over 5 million species. I was at a Herbie Hancock concert last night, and he asked a really good question. He said, how many families are there in the world? He said, there's only one family. And then he said, no one likes everyone in their family, which is a really good point. These are all fungi, but they compete with each other, and many of them are not very alike. So as many of you know, when we're foraging, we really interact with basidiomycetes and ascomycetes quite a bit. And then some of these other ones are in the mix as well. And just 3 examples to show you how much the fungal lifestyle can vary in the woods. Amanita mushrooms, they're usually mycorrhizal. They exchange nutrients with trees, but occasionally some species can be saprobic. And they're symbiotic with many tree species. They're very diverse in that way. Ganoderma sessile, the urban reishi, as I call it, is really fascinating because you'll most often find it in urban environments. It really likes disturbance. And for whatever reason, it seems to really like the landscapes that humans create. And it's saprobic as well. And then enoki mushrooms, they're saprobic, but what's special about them is they like really cold temperatures. And enoki produces a natural antifreeze compound that slows the rate at which ice crystals form. So it's really interesting how all these mushrooms have a very different lifestyle. Fungi are also in soils. The soil food web is very complicated. And when we look at soil, while we might just see dirt, there's actually so much going on underneath our feet. There's a Leonardo da Vinci quote that I think is very relevant, where he says, "We know more about the movement of celestial bodies than of the soil underfoot." And just to give you an example, in 1 teaspoon of soil, there might be anywhere from 1 million to 1 billion bacteria. So fungi are involved in that soil food web, and that's just one small part of all the amazing things that they do. And then just looking briefly at our history. When we think of prehistory, we think a lot of figures like the dinosaurs, but fungi are actually a lot more ancient than dinosaurs, and we don't know a lot about their origins. There are some people that think the fungi could be as old as 2.4 billion years old, but we're not going to account for that because those scientific reports are fairly fringe. What we can say fairly confidently is that fungi are anywhere from 1.2 billion years old to around 500 million years old. And around 500 million years old, everyone starts agreeing on that. But where that places them is that they're about as old as all plants and older than animals. So all of us showed up here after fungi, which I think is pretty amazing. And humans are just there at the end, a tiny blip in the history of the world, thinking that we're important and thinking that we know everything. And fungi can also be very extreme personalities. On the range of the fungal lifestyles, there are some truly incredible cases. I'm sure people have heard about fungi that can eat plastics, but an example that I like to bring up is radiotrophic fungi. So researchers have found that fungi have been growing in the reactors in Chernobyl, in the cooling towers, and they're actually able to either eat the ionizing radiation or grow better in its presence. And these fungi have been sent onto the International Space Station, where they have been grown and shown to actually reduce the amount of ionizing radiation in an area. I think that's pretty amazing. But perhaps out of all of the evolutionary mechanisms that fungi have evolved, degrading lignin might be the most significant. Lignin is a molecule that's in all plants, all vascular plants in our world, and around 300 million years ago, fungi figured out how to degrade it. Why is this so difficult and why is it so important? Well, lignin is a fairly complex molecule. It's composed of these lignols, which are smaller building blocks, and different types of plants have different types of lignols in them. These are pretty difficult to break down. And when fungi figured out how to decompose them, it meant that a lot of nutrition was accessible to them. Suddenly, the forests looked like food to fungi. So broadly speaking, we can divide many of the fungi we interact with into 2 categories: brown rot fungi, which are the ones that don't have the ability to degrade lignin and instead mainly subsist on cellulose. So chicken of the woods is a good example. We still love eating that mushroom, but it does not decompose lignin. And then we have white rot fungi, like Ganoderma species. They eat lignin and cellulose. They even eat themselves. When a Ganoderma species gets a little older, it will remyceliate its fruiting body and use itself for nutrition. So what have we learned in this brief background of fungi? We learned that they're a very diverse kingdom. They have a very diverse set of hosts. They can be mycorrhizal or saprobic. And they have complicated, resilient lifestyles. They can be found in many different ecosystems, both terrestrial and aquatic. And they have the ability to occupy extremely complex niches. So with that being said, I have a question for you today. This is how many gourmet and of the mushroom species we love are grown today, in plastic bags in warehouses and facilities. Does this way of growing mushrooms suitably represent the complexity of how fungi live? Let's look at some of the ways that this way of growing mushrooms, which I call the mushroom monoculture, can be negatively perceived. Now, I'm not saying that this style of growing mushrooms is all bad, but there are some drawbacks. Everyone mainly grows the same species. A handful of cultures are passed around in an industry. You've probably seen different color pleurotus or oyster mushroom species, some shiitakes. Occasionally, you'll see hen of the woods. Lion's mane mushrooms are in there, chestnut mushrooms, but the range of species is fairly small. Many of these fungi are not native to the places where people are growing them. In fact, they might potentially be invasive. There are some reports of certain pleurotus species from other parts of the world popping up in different parts of the United States. I think all that research is very new and we don't really know yet. They grow on very questionable substrates. This book is one that I found online, Growing Gourmet Mushrooms for Profit. And it shows that this style of growing mushrooms has become very industrialized. People want to make money and they want to do it fast. And mushrooms have become a suitable business model for that. They want to do that by maximizing profit. And to do that, they get the substrates, the sawdust that mushrooms are being grown on from pretty strange sources. They've been found to have heavy metals in them. You don't really know what you're getting unless you trust the person that is growing your mushrooms. Some of these mushrooms that are being grown are not climate adapted because there's no care being put into the cultures that are collected. And the final products are subpar. I also want to mention that a lot of the bags that these mushrooms are grown in, there's claims of them being biodegradable. I've never been able to confirm that at all. I've only been able to find that the biodegradable plastic bags that are used actually just degrade into microplastics. So that, in my opinion, is a fraudulent claim. Really, this business model is built on instant profit and is not very considerate of the future. That's not to say that there aren't benefits to it. It's really nice to be able to produce mushrooms quickly and reliably. But one of the main downfalls of this system is that it approaches mushroom cultivation as an annual system. In other words, you inoculate your substrate, you wait about a month to 3 months, and you get your mushrooms. But you don't keep producing mushrooms for a long period of time. And these are just some examples. These are from co-ops in Oregon that I've taken. That's hen of the woods. That's lion's mane versus a wild lion's mane. You can eat a slug too, if you like the wild one. These are some oyster mushrooms. This is Margot, my girlfriend, with oysters. That day we found like 50 pounds of oyster mushrooms and dehydrated all of them. It was great. So which would you rather grow and which would you rather eat? These beautiful wild native cultures or many of these mushrooms that you see at the grocery store, which I don't view as being a very good final product. If we want to grow better mushrooms, I think a very good first step would be collecting more cultures, collecting native cultures. And that's something that's not too difficult to do. I think everyone here, or most people here, would be able to do it at home. You can collect native cultures using things you have around the house. There's also probably people in this club that have equipment already. But basically, you need a pressure cooker, and you can do this in mason jars or petri dishes if you have them, using agar powder, which you can buy at the co-op. Basically, you sterilize agar powder, and then you slice some fresh tissue once the agar is sterilized, and you grow out the culture and clean it up a bit. That's some Ganoderma sessile culture that I've isolated. I have a lot of those that I've collected. And you start to build up a culture bank and preserve your native fungi when you do this. If you want to learn more about how to do this, you can ask me afterwards. You can also collect cultures by just soaking cardboard in boiling hot water and then placing either the mycelia or the stem butts of mushrooms onto the cardboard and letting it myceliate out. Then you can expand the culture by sterilizing grain. That's some good photos. There's an agar slant right there, and you can see it covering all this grain. Once that grain is colonized, it's a really versatile spawn that can be spread out into a lot of different media. You can see down here, I've expanded it onto some wood chips and it's growing everywhere. You can also just take the cardboard that you colonized and put it into wood chips with some wheat bran. But these are basic ways that there's a lot of resources on, some of which I have up here, that you can grow mushrooms and collect cultures at home. And it's a good first step at advancing our mushroom cultivation methods. Now we're going to talk a little bit of how to grow mushrooms in different ways, in perennial systems. You know, I talked about how one of the things I didn't like about growing mushrooms in bags is that it was instant. It only considered the first mushroom production and not the overall circular system that the mushrooms were a part of. Just like when we find mushrooms in nature, it's never just a mushroom. It's always on a tree. It's always on something else. You know, we have to zoom out a bit. So this is the Three Sisters. This is a traditional Native American way of growing corn, beans, and squash, where the plants are intercropped. But what if we added a fungal partner to this relationship? So in this relationship, the corn provides the trellis that the beans can climb up, and the squash provides shade for the rest of the plants. The beans will fix nitrogen and they'll all fix carbon, obviously, and they all work together. What if we inoculated that system and put straw at the base or wood chips and added some oyster mushrooms or some wine caps, some stropharia mushrooms? Well, let's look at this as a circular system. We'll start at harvest season, pretending that you already had a Three Sisters garden one year. You harvest your corn and your beans and they're dried for storage. Already, you have some yields there. You have some long-term storage food. You can harvest your corn and then use that corn either for your own food or to produce the grain spawn to produce mushrooms. You also have the corn stalks and the bean plants that were left over in the field. With those, they're comprised of 87% cellulose. You can shred them up and leave them in your garden. When the fall rains come in October and the ground is moist, you can introduce your inoculants. Take your culture, like I have here, sprinkle it in to the corn stalks that have been shredded up or whatever other straw or mulch you have in there, and you've now inoculated your garden. So you have your wine caps and your corn husk, and then at that point you harvest your squash. From this, you get a couple different yields. You get mushrooms, and you also turn those corn stalks and plant materials into a fertility product. As they degrade, they're going to release nutrients into the soil and continue to make your garden healthier. It's also less work for you. So it's a human yield, you know, less time that you spend dragging all the wasted plant material into the garbage or your compost pile. That makes life easier for you. Then mid to late October, once you've harvested all your plants, you can introduce a cover crop. And what that basically means is we never want to leave soil bare in agriculture. It's really unhealthy for it. So in the fall time, you could grow buckwheat, or you could grow rye, you could grow a lot of different crops. So those will grow, and as they do, you have a couple different benefits. You have carbon sequestration, so that's good for the environment, and it's also good for your soil. You might have nitrogen fixation if you grow a nitrogen fixing cover crop. And you also have this process called rhizophagy going on. And what that means is that as these plants grow, they're secreting sugars into the soil food web that feed microbes and create a really healthy microbial environment. Now, it's pretty much time to wait on your garden, and it's wintertime. The growing season is over. But it's mushroom season now. One of the great things about the Pacific Northwest is that you have growing season all summer, and then you have mushroom season in the fall and winter. So you can spend time in the winter collecting culture, as we discussed. And what are the benefits you get from this? You get fungal diversity. So by collecting those cultures, you're in essence saving their seed and preparing to inoculate them into the garden into spring. And then you also get a time to reflect on your growing season, reflect on the year, think about the temperature, and think about the next year. Now, in the springtime, once things start to warm up again, you could do another inoculation. So you were growing your cover crop, your rye or your other plant. Before it goes to seed, you'll cut it down. You'll mow it down, or you'll scythe it down. And the reason you do that is it will fall to the ground, and as those fungi decompose it, it'll make your soil richer. So what do we get from this? You might get some seed if you decided to let your cover crop go to seed, though ideally you wouldn't. You'll get soil fertility, and you'll feed your fungi. Think about it. You don't want to leave your fungi in one place with no food and just soil to eat. They need cellulose and they need food. And in this way, we're making this system perennial. We're making it last longer than just a year by feeding them. Then your season begins again. You seed your corn, then your squash and your beans. So when you're growing these plants, it attracts pollinators, it fixes nitrogen. You're also getting that rhizophagy, and you're getting carbon sequestration, and you're getting mushrooms. If you irrigate your plots, you might see some mushrooms in the summer because the squash plants will give shade and the water that's trapped in between the soil and the leaves of the squash plants will make a really nice microclimate. So this is just one example of how we can grow mushrooms perennially in a circular system rather than growing them in bags and produce waste. I've also got an example from a personal friend of mine. This is a farmer, his name's Mark, and he's got a company called Keyline Vermont. So this is a small to medium-sized farm. He does great things in Vermont, and he produces firewood and timber wood. He also has sheep and a good amount of forest land. And he decided he wanted to explore mushroom cultivation. So this is a really, really good example of organized shiitake log production. You see he stacks them like Lincoln logs. And then he's got some misting up here. You can see there's some naturally shaded areas and then also some introduced shade. He's got a tub where he can soak them. But these mushroom logs will produce shiitakes for several years. And that's a really good thing. No waste is really being used, maybe some minimal waste. But you're going to get abundant flushes of mushrooms like we see on this table for years to come. Now, Mark does some other interesting things on his farm. He's a really knowledgeable person on coppicing, which is a system of woodland management, where if you've ever seen a tree that's been cut down and it starts to send out these new shoots, what that is the tree's existing root system already has access to nutrients in the soil, and it can use those adult roots to send out these new shoots. So it has a developed root system already. So Mark is very knowledgeable about it, and he's got a book on it up here called Coppice Agroforestry, which I encourage you to check out. But he basically decided that he was going to plant a bunch of trees, and he was eventually going to coppice them to produce timber wood, firewood, and also wood for mushrooms. It's really good to have high quality wood when you grow mushrooms, because there's a few different things that are important when you grow mushrooms. One thing is if the log has intact bark, because the mushrooms need that bark to have this little microclimate here to fruit out of. And for every inch of diameter you have on a log, you get about 1 year of mushroom production, give or take. So in Mark's system, he has these coppice trees that grow. And then he also has sheep and livestock that graze through the trees. So as he grows these trees, he grows a few different species. He grows black locust, he grows hardy pecan, butternut, and bur oak. He plants them and they grow. He gets a timber yield, a pole wood yield, a firewood yield. He's also sequestering carbon. The black locust trees are amazing nitrogen fixers. They're also one of the highest nectar producing trees. So if you ever wanted to have honeybees or just feed native bees, those trees are doing that. And then, like I said, he has sheep. The sheep can eat the young shoots that the trees send off, and they're incredibly nutritious food for them. So the ruminants and the sheep will graze those trees in that coppice, and they'll get really good nutrition. Then the sheep will poop out some of that fertility back onto the trees, refeeding this system, incorporating fertility in. It's free landscaping. If you think about it, less work that you have to do on your property because the sheep are dealing with the weeds for you. It's also a food yield and a clothing yield. You get milk, wool, and meat potentially if he was milking the goats. And also he grazes these animals in the really hot summers. So as they go under the trees in this agroforestry system, it's a lot of shelter for them from the sun. So you can see how that's really integrated. So step 2 of this system would be that timber can be harvested from it as he wishes. And a lot of different things can be made from this timber. It can be made into, structures. His house is really elegantly built. It's a super insulated house, and they heat it with firewood. They use about a quart of wood a year. And because it's so insulated, that's a pretty small amount for a family. They get a really good economic yield out of this, selling the pole wood and timber. They get a lot of flexibility in their production. It's wood, right? So you choose when you cut it down. And then after you've cut it down, depending on what you need to use it for, you can store it for a long time. So it's really versatile in that way. Now, moving from this, Mark has decided that he can put some of these logs into mushroom production. So he can select maybe some of the logs from his oak trees and decide to inoculate them with mushrooms. From that, he gets food production in shaded areas. Think as a farmer, if you have a lot of sunny area, that's valuable to you, but you can't grow a lot in a ton of shade. You can't grow mushrooms. You also get a lot of soil fertility as the mushrooms break down the logs. He can put those in his garden and that'll increase his organic matter. It's a really ergonomic design for him to grow mushrooms too, because they're stacked like I showed you, like Lincoln logs. It really makes a lot of sense. So it's a lot of peace of mind for him. It's also a great design because Mark can store these logs and then inoculate them at a point. He can also soak the logs to trigger fruiting. So it's really up to him. He's almost like an alchemist transmuting the wood into mushrooms as he sees fit. So eventually these mushrooms return as they return to the soil and contribute organic matter that these tree species can grow bigger and stronger from. So the main system benefits here. This is boosting soil fertility. It's producing a lot of food, a lot of different types of food, plants, nuts, meat, mushrooms. It's stacking yields. You get all these different things in one system. And it's a really circular design. And then it also has economic viability because Mark is a farmer. You need to be able to make money, and mushrooms can help you do that. Some considerations with this system, though, is Mark doesn't produce his own spawn. He's a farmer and he's busy, so he buys his spawn. Maybe it's not adapted to his environment. It kind of lacks a little bit of fungal diversity. He's growing mainly shiitake and a couple oysters. So that's maybe one element that he could work on. Try growing chicken of the woods, even though that's one that's a little bit harder. Though apparently from some people here, it is possible. And he doesn't collect native cultures. So maybe by collecting native cultures, he could see what mushrooms are already growing on wood and then in his area and then introduce them more. And he's only using hardwoods. We talk about growing mushrooms a lot, and maybe it's different here in the Pacific Northwest, but in the Northeast, people mainly grow on hardwoods. But there's mushrooms you can grow on softwoods. You could grow mushrooms for dyeing things like dyer's polypore, and you could out here grow conifer chicken of the woods. There's a ton of things you could do on conifers. So a couple examples of people that are collecting native cultures. This guy, Jacob Alvarez on Instagram, I really encourage you guys to check him out. He just really fell in love with beefsteak mushrooms, fistulina. And he was by this forest with an incredible abundance of beefsteak mushrooms. And he just decided, I'm going to save all their cultures because I think they're valuable. It turns out they were valuable. This all comes from one forest, and it's an Amazon facility now. It all got chopped down. Because of him, these cultures live on. This is some of the other stuff he's done. Look at that Laetoporus diversity. That's just so cool. These all look so different. And this is an example of how he's taken that beefsteak and grown it onto agar. Someone else who's really good at this is Ryan Paul Gates of Terrestrial Fungi. Should really check out his website. He grows cordyceps, and cordyceps is a little bit different because it's an ascomycete. He has to produce these master cultures, which are just beautiful to look at. And he's been growing cordyceps on chicken eggs recently, which is pretty cool. And then he also saves a lot of Ganoderma reishi cultures. You should really check out his website. He's got hundreds that he's done in total, and they just all look so different and beautiful. So other ways that you can just think about growing mushrooms in your own community. This is my friend Kiko here, and he is a woodworker. He's also really into scything, and he produces a lot of grass and straw on his property because of that. So if you know any woodworkers, I encourage you to connect with them, because if you're a mushroom cultivator, they are the absolute best people to know. He has tons of different piles of wood chips and wood that's all really good quality that I trust, of all these different grits and sizes that are useful. And so I went over to his house and we just decided as a project, I took a quart-sized jar of mushroom spawn here. And we decided we were going to expand it out and inoculate his whole property with it. So really low energy to create one jar of spawn. So at first we sprinkled it just onto wood chips and mixed it in. And then we built this little incubation chamber. So this is the bucket that's inoculated here, has a lot of different types of wood and straw in there. And then we put it in a second bucket that had straw in it. And what that does is when we spray this straw, it traps the moisture in there and it makes a really nice microclimate. Just like you find mushrooms in the fall, they need that moisture to live and grow. And this was a couple days later. This is that mycelium first starting to spread out. And then we put it on some cardboard. You can see it's growing out a lot and it's really happy. And by now we have an entire bucket that's filled with spawn. So starting out from just this one jar and using waste materials that he has on his property, we're now going to be able to spread these mushrooms out all over his property. And then he also had some Ganoderma brownii or Ganoderma applanatum, really similar. I don't think we totally know what the difference is between them yet, but he had some of it growing on his property. And I just decided I'd collect some. That's what this is in this bag. And we'd see if we can grow it out. So we just got some cardboard and we stuck it on there, and it's myceliating. And so if anybody wants any of this at the end of the talk, feel free to come grab some and grow some reishi. So I challenge you to find me a plant material that can't be broken down by fungi. You know, we think about growing mushrooms in these bags and these facilities that are really intensive with energy, but maybe we should just think about it in a simpler way. Mushrooms degrade plants, and pretty much all the plants around us can be eaten by mushrooms. So think about your life and think about the waste products you produce. How can you put that into a system that fungi eat it? There's a ton of that in this book here. Some of you may have seen Organic Mushroom Farming and Microremediation by Trad Cotter. He illustrates a lot of these different methods, like burying logs for ground dwelling fungi, or you could stack logs like Mark's shiitake, or you could grow them in straw. It's really, there's so many ways of growing mushrooms, and you got to be the explorer and develop your own ways of cultivating them. So mushrooms did all the work. They evolved. You know, they evolved to digest everything, to grow these beautiful, delicious structures. All we need to do is pay attention and quote unquote save their seed, take spore prints too, and we have to value them as decomposers. So just reiterating some of this, we could have normal grain and crop production in agriculture, or we could produce wood, or we could have pre-existing waste. And when we funnel them through the mycelial network, we get a lot of different yields. We get secondary food yields like mushrooms, soil fertility, and organic matter. We'll talk about waste remediation, soil microbiota increase when fungi are around. You establish human connections. We're all here in this room right now because we love mushrooms. And I know, just like me, when you talk to your friends about mushrooms that don't know a lot about mushrooms, they find you really interesting. We also get a lot of biodiversity. Fungi actually allow some plants to germinate a lot of native seeds. If you've heard of the plant wintergreen, which is what's in gum, or it's also what's in root beer, wintergreen is part of the heath family, and it can't germinate without its fungal symbiont. So native fungi are also really important for native seeds and plants. You also prevent erosion when you have a lot of fungal diversity in soil. That mycelium holds together the soil. As we'll talk about as well, it increases carbon sequestration, and it's inspiring a lot of these circular systems. So more resources to learn specifically about cultivating mushrooms. I've got one of these books up here. This other one by Paul Stamets is a classic, really easy to find a copy of it online or in a bookstore. And you can learn everything you need to know about the essentials of growing mushrooms in these books. Now we're going to talk a little bit about growing mushrooms in more large-scale agricultural contexts and how fungi are important in soil. So I'm going to play this video. Yeah. So this is a fungus here, and that's its mycelium. This is in real time. The layer you see around it is a biofilm. It's some water that's accumulated around it. And all those little dots are Pseudomonas bacteria swimming along it. Once again, this is in real time. So as we speak, these guys are outside doing this. And this is a fungus that is creating biodiversity. It's attracting these other microbes around it. So what does this Pseudomonas do? Why is it good that this fungus is allowing it to exist? Well, Pseudomonas are really complex. They're a very diverse genus. One example is that it lives in the gut of some worms and soil, and it can convert styrene oil, which is what's in polystyrene, into PHA, which is biodegradable. It can also remediate naphthalene in contaminated soils. It's a biocontrol agent. It can help deal with common fungal pathogens in agricultural settings. One Pseudomonas species can take this nitrogen and cyanide that's triple bonded to a carbon. It's really hard for us to do this, and it requires a lot of energy to break this bond, but some Pseudomonas species can just break that bond and use this nitrogen as a nitrogen source, as a food source. So it can degrade cyanide and use it as food. Really cool microbes, and without fungi, they couldn't really live as well as they do. They can also break down toluene, which is a petroleum refining byproduct. And fungal dominance in ecosystems is something that is very common, actually. When we see mycelium in soil, we think it might be mycorrhizal, or we think we might know that we can see all fungi, but there's actually only a very few fungal species that we can see with our eyes. Many of the fungi that are beneficial in soil are, for example, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. They're microscopic and we can't see their mycelium most of the time. So looking in nature, you have different levels of fungal dominance in soil. And this goes along with plant succession. If you were to clear cut an area and then watch it turn back into a forest again, the fungi would evolve with that forest. So the areas where we have the least fungi in soil would be very aerobic land. Think of an intensively tilled farmland with a lot of weeds. Then as those systems become a little more aerobic, include more grasses, early and mid grasses, you see about 0.3 to 0.75 fungal cells per every one bacterial cell. Then these ecosystems continue to evolve, and the most fungally dominant systems are old growth conifer forests like the ones that we have here in the Pacific Northwest. And those are incredibly interconnected systems. You think of the mycelium, all the connections it creates, and think about how amazing it is that just one bacteria can ride the biofilms of 1,000 fungal cells. So really amazing. And as fungal dominance in soil goes up, you have increasing ecosystem productivity that goes up as well. What does that mean? This all comes from the work of Dr. David Johnson, who looked at fungal dominance in soils and agricultural settings. This is the fungal dominance number. Everything else is controlled. So if we have 0.3 fungal cells per every one bacterial cell in the greenhouse, that's how the plants grow, versus 5 fungal cells. It has an incredible effect on plant growth. Does anyone have a guess on where most agricultural soils in the Pacific Northwest are? Yeah, they're in between here and here. A lot of them are here. So think of your food. We could be doing a lot better. It might be hard to get there, but we can do this. So how do we do this? How do we bring back those fungi in soil? Well, the same researcher, David Johnson, figured out that you can re-inoculate soil. You can take all these beneficial fungi and bacteria and put them back in. So using a pretty simple composting process, though very specific, this researcher figured out that you can break down organic matter and produce an incredibly microbially diverse compost. And what he does with this is he dilutes the compost in water, and then he'll send it through either drip irrigation or a sprinkler system. He just basically emulsifies it in water and then sends it into agricultural soils, and it re-inoculates the soil. And this system is mimicking the creation of fertility in areas such as the Great Plains, where naturally you would have an animal that would eat grasses, poop out the fertility, and as the grasses went through its gut, it would be inoculated and it would be deposited into the soil. And over thousands of years, you have organic matter and fertility that's building up. This system is a way of trying to fast track that and repair our agricultural soils. What does this actually do? Well, if we look at some of the results, which all this research is very new, you can almost entirely eliminate or just eliminate nitrogen fertilizer application only through re-inoculating soils. Composting is BEAM, which is biologically enhanced agricultural management. So producing cotton, you produce more just with the inoculant than you do with nitrogen fertilizer, meaning that farmers can not only save by not buying the fertilizer, they also save because they can produce and sell more. That's also just a photo of a farmer with a plant that just has the inoculant and no fertilizer versus the one with the fertilizer. So this is an incredibly productive system that has some warrant in us looking into a little bit more. It reduces our dependence on fertilizers. and it increases plant biomass, carbon sequestration, and their total photosynthetic capacity. It can also massively reduce soil salinity. It's a huge problem in California. You have these soils that become incredibly saline following agricultural practices. These microbes can help reduce that. So it's relevant there. And as we saw with the Pseudomonas species, look how diverse this compost is. When you inoculate that into the soil, a lot of these microbes have the ability to degrade contaminants. And so that can be a benefit as well. Overall, you're just really incorporating a lot of these native microbiota into soil where they should be. And this is a practice that has been developed multiple times in the world. This is Korean natural farming, or KNF as some people call it. This is something that I practice a little bit, and it's a method that was developed in the 1930s and 20th century. The Koreans somehow figured out, without knowing exactly what to call these microbes, that aerobic microbes and some of these fungi are really good for plant growth. You can see here, these are these inoculants that they create and then spread out into the garden. Same deal here. These increase productivity of plants and the fertility of soil. The fungi are really central to the methodology, and you can create fertilizers in this methodology. This is some nettle or stinging nettle that I've fermented using the Korean method, and I use this as a nitrogen fertilizer. And it's a very considerate methodology, Korean natural farming. It's circular, and they think about treating the ecosystem well using the native microbes. So we don't know yet. What we do know is that microbes are complex. We don't know everything about these worlds, though. I'm going to give you a pretty shocking example of how complex they are to sort of start wrapping this up. This is a swarm of E. coli. And as we all know, antibiotic resistance is a pretty worrying problem in our modern world. You know, sometimes we are able to completely kill a swarm when we take antibiotics, but sometimes we don't kill all the microbes. And what happens when that occurs? You know, there can be antibiotics in some of the water we drink, the food that we eat, and sometimes it's not enough to kill a microbial swarm like this. So in the case that the bacteria don't die, one of two things can happen. They can be exposed to a little bit of antibiotic, and bacteria have these mechanisms called efflux pumps, where the antibiotic is pumped out of their body, and that's kind of their method of detoxifying their cells. So in a bacteria that doesn't get a lot of antibiotic, it pumps out a little bit of antibiotic and it's fine. It doesn't get stressed out and there's no gene mutation. But if a bacteria is exposed to a lot of antibiotics, but not enough to kill it, this is what happens. It pumps out those antibiotics and it gets stressed out. This leads to gene mutation. And through that gene mutation, it develops antibiotic resistance. Now, that was already established many years ago. What we just figured out this year, and this is from researchers at the University of Texas at Austin, is that not only can they become resistant, but swarms of bacteria will work together to make sure that the antibiotic resistant bacteria have priority over the normal swarm. So antibiotic resistant bacteria, usually there's a compromise. The resistant ones are a little bit physically weaker than the non-resistant ones. So what does the swarm do about this? This edge here is where a lot of nutrients would be, and there's less competition. It will push the purple resistant bacteria that are weaker to the edge so they have more access to nutrients. They do this because they know if they're exposed to more antibiotics, they can preserve these genetics and they'll survive. So the bacteria are essentially talking and communicating, knowing that antibiotics might be coming and they're preserving their genes. If we play the video, there's actually a video of this happening. So this is the normal swarm, and this is the antibiotic resistant swarm on this edge here. They've moved them over to the side because they're essentially babying them and make sure that those genetics live on. So it's a pretty scary thought. All these microbes are talking and they're communicating, and we really don't know what's going on with microbes. So it's important that we study it. So in conclusion, we know that fungi and microbes are important in many ways. They're important as food, as we all know. We love them as foragers. They're important for soil health and for microbial diversity. They're important for human systems. You know, mycologists are funny people. We're all a little strange, but I'm sure that a lot of our friends really value us in that we approach things differently. We have a different take on things. And that's because we've studied fungi and looked at them in their natural systems. You can create and foster a lot of these mycological systems by collecting these native cultures. But in order to do this, you need to remember that human community is important as well. We can't do this all on our own. There needs to be people in this club that are better at preserving cultures, others that are better at growing food, and people with all these different roles of using fungi. That's really central to this. You know, mushrooms are social, but we are too. You got to act local and you got to reduce waste. I think it's really ridiculous the point that we're at. We know that the planet is in crisis and we know that we're not treating it well. And yet a lot of us, you know, we're busy people. We still produce a lot of waste and we try not to blame ourselves for it too much, but I think we can do better. You know, fungi can degrade a lot of the waste, and we also need to make a cultural shift into just treating our planet well and respecting it. We all prosper when we do these things. You know, we all prosper when we share food with one another. It was really nice coming to this club, and the first thing that I saw was garden veggies. It's just good. People sharing food, that's essential, you know. Go back. Great, yeah. So that's good. You know, it's good that people are already doing these things, you know, and, you know, these connections are mycelial, you know, just like the mushrooms connect in the soil. We are doing this here in this club as well. And we really have to be considerate and think of nature. You know, we've got to think of nature if we're going to move forward and we're going to adapt our systems. I don't mean just caring for nature, but I mean thinking about nature, observing it and learning from it, because there's so much learning we still have to do. And observation is crucial. You know, we talk about all these methods of growing fungi. There's no better teacher than the woods. When you go to the woods, look at how the fungi are growing, not simply what they're growing on, but what is the environment they're in? What direction are they facing? Are they facing south towards the sun? What is happening? You know, those are all really crucial. And we all have a responsibility to do that. Not just because we're interested in mushrooms, not just because we like mushrooms, but because we live here in the Pacific Northwest and we want to keep appreciating these things. And in order to do that, we have to take care of our environments. So if you'd like to contact me more, got my website there and my email. I have all the resources that I use to make this presentation if you're curious about sources. The reactors that I talked about here that make this compost, I build these. They're really cheap to make. If you're interested in it, I'll come build one for you for under $100. And also, if you'd just like to talk to me about farming or fungi, I'm really involved in agriculture in Corvallis, and I come down to Eugene occasionally. Also, if you want to share cultures, that's a great idea. If you send me a culture that's pretty clean, I'll produce some grain spawn with it for you. I use local grains and I help grow corn with my work. I've also got some corn seed here. This is the open oak party mix, which is a dry farmed corn that's adapted to the climate of the Pacific Northwest. So if you want some of that, just chunk some seeds off and take it home. And then I've also just got a non-mushroom related present that everyone can take if they want. These are milkweed pods. And the other day, my girlfriend Margot and I had some of these and we were in the car. Don't do this if you're driving alone. But if you have a passenger, you can open the window and these are like dandelions, so they'll fly. And there's like hundreds of seeds. If you just go on the highway and you put these out the window, it just flies everywhere and you've seeded a road. It's pretty incredible. So I've got a ton of those. And that's about all.
Have any questions? Please. I have a question about containers on. I've used driving before. You find one better than the other?
So grains do work better than the others a lot of the time because of numerous factors. One could be the nutrition of the grain. I use popcorn the most, and the reason for that is I really like popcorn because corn has the thick pericarp on it, and I think it reduces contamination because the mushrooms will get through that skin, but not a lot of other things can. So physically, different grains can be different. And then also nutrition-wise, an interesting secret of mine is that buckwheat is a very important grain for growing mushroom. Buckwheat has something called rutin in it, which is a plant pigment, and buckwheat will cause mushrooms to fruit a lot faster. There's a study on this with hericium you can look up where they use buckwheat and it produced mushrooms when without buckwheat it wouldn't. So rye is good. Barley's good. Barley's also produced a lot in the valley. Good to use local grains, wheat, but a lot of things work. So find what works for you.
You know what substrate, what species the fish are in the factory is going on?
I don't. Though I'll say from my experience in the Northeast, I found it on a lot of things. But that guy's very active, so you could send him a message or I could. And yeah.
So I've got this huge pile of chips from the sycamore.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering what I'm able to throw on that.
Oysters. Sycamore is everywhere in Indiana where I'm from. And those photos of all the oyster mushrooms that I had in there, those are all on sycamore. Specifically Austriatus, the winter oysters.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sea lions made in North Carolina growing on sycamores also, you can try that.
Okay. Cool. Got a huge one. The other question.
I have one. What's the downside of all of this? Like, why not everyone doing this?
I think that's a good question. I think there's many reasons, and one is that these things take a lot of knowledge. You know, it's a complicated thing. It's kind of weird because mushroom culture in the United States has kind of exploded recently. A lot of people grow on logs and in bags, but it takes quite a while, as all of you know, to really understand mushrooms. And so people are just kind of getting the hang of things. It's also not really done in like commercial and agricultural settings because it takes time and it needs, you need someone to focus on it. So I think the reason it's not being done is a human problem of us needing to kind of change perspective. In like commercial settings or, well, there's a lot of profit in not doing it for specific people. If you start growing mushrooms and thinking about diversity in soil, you have to stop using Roundup. There's a lot of money for very specific people to discourage low till or less tilling in soils and growing diversity and growing all these things because people can't sell farming equipment. They can't sell pesticides when we start thinking about ecology and not profit.
Right, and I think the other thing is that a lot of this stuff is not instant. And we live in this instant society, capitalism, and if you can't make a profit right away, then you don't do it. And some of this stuff takes time and planning and patience.
Who was it that told me about the chicken of the woods that they grew? Yeah. Yeah, chicken of the woods, they grew, it took them 7 years to do it. They inoculated a log and they forgot about it, and then it grew chicken of the woods. And that's because they cared for it and wanted to grow chicken of the woods, not because they wanted to make a buck off of it, which you could do, but it's about caring for things, not making money necessarily. Yeah. Who wants to take a shot? I would say that it's a big polypore, definitely wouldn't be good to eat.
There's a problem. Yeah, I was taking a walk.
Like which are the easiest?
Yeah, as far as.
Oyster is the easiest. Oyster is one of the most aggressive white rot fungi. And so it just produces really well. And it's really easy to trigger fruiting. Yeah. And they're delicious. Yeah.
I've been thinking about this for a long time. We tried cultivating mushrooms. But I don't see very convinced. Okay.
Yeah.
what might happen. It's, you know, my scared.
That's a great point. And, especially when you think about like how aggressive fungi can be, like I talked about the giant armillaria, that's a huge forest pathogen and one mushroom can do a lot of damage. So we really don't know. And that's why I think it's a good idea to just stick to growing native things. There's a question I have about like, how native do we need to be? Because sometimes like I want to grow species from the east out here and I haven't done it yet because I'm like, should I? I don't know, but I'm attached to those things. And that's kind of a human question. We move around the world and is it our responsibility to kind of accept we're not in where we used to be?
I really think we should grow what is native, for example, to the southern Willamette Valley.
Yeah.
It could be technically east. Cascades, but Oregon is a political boundary, it's fine.
Mhm.
Just stop growing in Oregon because it's native.
Yeah. I'll say to that, I think that's a great idea and I definitely agree. I think it's obviously a lot less potentially dangerous to grow something from the Western US as a whole than something from a different country or the Eastern US, because if something's probably east of the Cascades, there's probably a decent chance that it could have moved around a lot by now. That's not a hard rule, but I agree that we should just try and be Willamette Valley, west of the Cascades.
You ever opportunity to get tips to stock there? It's the eastern, looks like a oyster.
Yes,
Very.
elm oysters.
Yes, yes, almost. We got some spots from that. It's interesting.
Mhm.
Spotlight. It's oyster in there. I went into the garage one day, after I was a kid, and the rifle going through the water, over the edge and down onto the concrete.
Wow.
And I took it, buried it 7 feet deep in the garden, turned it with soil. Week later, it was fruiting out of the soil.
Yeah. Do you know where those are from?
It's either Midwest or Eastern.
Okay, because
It doesn't grow here naturally, like Dustin from the mushroomery.
Mhm.
He does a lot of things. We got that small.
I've found those a lot on sycamore as well in the Midwest. And yeah, I found them on trees and it's huge clusters.
But it was very patient.
Yeah.
I just want to make another comment. It's a species here, you're bringing in all this smoky stuff. And there's so many.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, and actually, and it's interesting, that's very relevant because in the valley, one of Oregon's largest exports is nursery stock. We're a huge nursery producer, and I mean, you'll always find people that find like Leucocaprinus brimbaulii, the yellow ones that pop up in houseplants, and that's from potting soil medium. Like there's a lot of stuff moving around. Yeah.
A lot of plant diseases have come in on nursery stocks. We've got a lot of other things coming in on nursery stock also.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. I work in agriculture and I see a lot of very worrying things about kind of the future of the forests and of our plants, because it only takes one single person or organism to bring one of these spores and it can completely devastate our ecosystems. The campus at Oregon State has a bunch of elm trees on it. And I'm from the Midwest and there's no elm trees there because Dutch elm disease killed them all. And we don't have any. So I'm from somewhere where there's supposed to be elm trees. And the first time I ever saw one that was mature was when I came here. And another good example is the rubber tree industry. There's a fungal pathogen of rubber that's in, I think, South America, but not Asia. Don't quote me on that. But it can destroy the rubber industry because a lot of rubber trees all come from one single clone. And so it's all very genetically similar. And if this fungal pathogen gets to Asia, tires are a lot more expensive. The world economy is ruined.
The elm trees on the Oregon State campus get their 4 times a year dose of tetracycline to keep the Dutch elm disease at bay. There's
Wow.
Dutch elm disease here.
I didn't,
It's expensive, but they spend the money and control it.
wow. That's good to know.
And one of the, points was, during California, through agriculture, from potable plants and fundamental trees.
Hmm.
And each year you can see the orchards come down, and again. Well, I'm just afraid
Point it down, it's here in Eugene now.
And it was introduced here in the forties in a hazelnut orchard.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's all over now.
Yeah.
It's got it in Mexico, and it's spread in Mexico.
It's kind of one of the big problems, you know, we can try and be ethical and have good management practices, but this is just an inevitability of global trade. And you know, I was doing some projects with honeybees, and there's all these companies that, you know, ship honeybees to the almond plantations in California. And there's this one that promises that it inspects every single honeybee to make sure it doesn't have a disease. And I'm like, there's no way. There's no way. It's gonna spread disease. Like, it's just gonna happen. Huh? Yeah.
And that's why we buy the greens from Hawaii. They're isolated there, and so. They don't have lights, they don't have together stuff.
Another one that's going to be a real problem for Eugene and for the entire West is the animal tax.
Yeah.
All over the east, it goes for it everywhere.
And that's why we're kind of in a tough spot, is because the world's moving fast and biodiversity is kind of getting crippled very fast. But you know, in order to connect, you know, this is a good way of relating back of why people aren't doing this. You got to slow down to do these things. Like you were saying, it's not instant. That's kind of a tough spot we're in. We have to move fast, but we also have to slow down to understand things. You know, that's probably one of the biggest predicaments we're in.
So there's maybe it's in there. That's difficult.
Yes. Yeah, like that's a good example. That's something I think we need to know more about, like Bovaria and Metarism. I have cultures of those, and you can actually get them. There's a guy, Appalachian Gold Fungi, Jeff Manganero, that sells them. These are fungi that colonize insects, and we might be able to use them in agriculture. They don't kill all insects, but they're really good because they'll get onto an insect and they'll spread it to all their friends. But you know, I mean, there is a lot of certification that's been done by the USDA that's looked into it, and there are native ones, but I've been kind of having a hard time finding exactly what is from where. So that's a consideration. Great.
Well, thank you, Charlie.
Yeah.
I invite everybody to come up and sort of look at what we've got up here. There's some books that he referred to. There's a shiitake log. You saw the pictures of how people grow shiitakes on logs. That's exactly what Joe does. And to his place, he's got stacks of them, just like Lincoln logs, and he grows a lot of them. And you sell them, or you just eat them all?
Yeah, we sell it, we don't sell it, we give it to friends and brothers.
Yeah, so cool. And again, there's this Piphilaris, I forget now which it is. We looked it up. There was a debate how it's pronounced, but it turns out it's the Greek pronunciation, not the Latin pronunciation. Anyway, so otherwise, we're through. You want to come up and talk to them? Come on up, I'm sure he'll talk to you. Otherwise, thank you everybody for being.